Nowadays, if you talk about interracial solidarity in the context of anti-racist struggle, you really run the risk of sounding like a hippie. The word solidarity evokes, in the minds of many people, the 1971 Coca-Cola commercial, in which a multiracial group of 100 or so teenagers stand on a California hilltop, each with a Coca-Cola in hand, singing "I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony." I think that is the association for a lot of people. What's much more common nowadays on the left is the politics of allyship and the associated discourse of privilege. Now this goes along with, it's correlated with a certain segregation of the movement that will be familiar to everyone. There's now the expectation that black people organize with black people with white people, Latinos with Latinos, Muslims with Muslims, immigrants with immigrants, and so on. I note this fact, this correlation, not because I want to diagnose it or criticize it here, but just because it was mentioned yesterday at the end of the Afro-pessimism talk, and I want to flag it. I think it's the elephant in the room at a lot of talks. I'm sure it will be the elephant in the room at the talk next door about black radicals on campus. It may not be literally next door, but it's on this hall. And I want to point to this elephant so that we can talk about it. The ISO stands in a proud tradition of multiracial anti-racist struggle, and we do not organize ourselves, and we do not participate in the movement in such ways as are more common. And that's, from the outside, maybe one of the more striking things about the ISO. And so and this goes along with us talking a lot about solidarity, which is in the title of many of the talks. And I just want to talk about what that is, what that's supposed to be, in short, to explain this stance. So in thinking about the question, I think it's helpful to start with a couple of pretty familiar remarks from the black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. These are on the handouts. Douglass writes, "The hostility between the poor whites and blacks of the South is easily explained. It has its root and sap in the relation of slavery, and it was incited on both sides by the cunning of the slave masters. Those masters secured their ascendancy over both the poor whites and the blacks by putting enmity between them. They divided both to conquer each." Elsewhere, Douglass writes, "The slaveholders, by encouraging the enmity of the poor laboring white man against the blacks, succeeded in making the said white man almost as much of a slave as the black himself. Both are plundered by the same plunderer." These two passages are often quoted, but I think it's worth spending a little time unpacking them and seeing what's contained in them. Douglass recognized the obvious fact that poor whites in the South enjoyed many privileges relative to their black counterparts. In fact, the first quotation comes from a letter in which Douglass was arguing that black people should have the right to vote, a right that their poor white counterparts already enjoyed. But Douglass thought that poor white people would be better off without white supremacy. That is, without the system of practices thanks to which poor whites enjoyed these privileges relative to their black counterparts. It was precisely that system of white supremacy that prevented poor whites and poor blacks from standing shoulder to shoulder against their common enemy, who was plundering them both. Of course, it's true, the slave owners, the plunderers, they were white. So there was a group of white people who benefited from the fact of white supremacy. But this was a very small fraction of the white people in the South. I think this brings out something important about the idea of privilege or benefit as a lens through which to think about oppression. ideas like privilege and benefit and advantage are relative. Consider the question all by itself. Did the poor white Southerner benefit from white supremacy? Before we can answer that question, we have to know, did the poor white Southerner benefit relative to whom? If we consider the position of a poor white person relative to that of their black counterpart, then obviously the answer is yes. The poor white Southerner benefited from white supremacy in that sense of benefit when we've got that comparison in view. But if we consider the situation of that same poor white Southerner relative to what their own situation would be if white supremacy were gone, the answer, or at least Frederick Douglass's answer, is no. They did not benefit from white supremacy. So if Douglass was right, then not all white people had the same interests. White people in the South were divided by class, and their interests were accordingly different and opposed. A small minority of whites who were slave owners had an interest in preserving white supremacy, but the majority of whites who were poor had an interest in destroying white supremacy. Insofar as the latter, the majority of whites, had an interest in destroying white supremacy, they shared an interest with all black people. Frederick Douglass was not a hippie. He was not naive about the suffering of black people. He did not minimize it. He did not sweep it under the rug. He did not treat it as less urgent than other issues of the day. He did not downplay the virulence of anti-black racism or the difficulty of overcoming it, but he could see a bigger picture. He could see that there was a certain way that someone like him was supposed to think about how his own society was divided up into opposing camps. Someone like him was supposed to think that whites were all in one camp and they had interest in one sort of thing, and that blacks were all in another camp, and they had an interest in the opposite thing. But Douglass could see that this picture was false, and that it was not merely false, it was a deception. It was a deception perpetrated by the white slave owners for the purpose of subjugating both poor whites and blacks. Now, the Marxist term for this kind of purposeful falsehood is ideology. So we can consider Frederick Douglass's remark, I think helpfully in connection with Marx's claim, Marx and Engels' claim in the German ideology that, quote, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. The system of racist ideas in terms of which the hostility, to use Douglass's term, the hostility played out between poor whites and blacks, this system of racist ideas belonged to the class of slave owners. It was theirs. It belonged to them not just in the sense that they were among the people who thought the relevant thoughts, but also in the sense that the circulation of those racist ideas served an important function in sustaining the power that slave owners exercised over everyone else, including poor whites. They were ruling ideas in the sense that it was their prevalence that enabled the rulers to rule. And notice that the crucial idea here, the one on which the whole ruse turns, was the idea that the correct way of understanding the structure of their society was as of one that was divided into two camps, with all the black people on one side and all the white people on the other. That was the crucial idea that was a ruling idea. Now, in seeing this, I'm still just unpacking what's in the quotations from Frederick Douglass. In seeing this, Frederick Douglass saw something that was not just on the surface of things, and something that could not serve its purpose if it were on the surface of things. If you want to clear a village of its inhabitants, there are two ways of doing it. One way is through a naked show of force. The soldiers can enter with guns drawn. The people who live there will see it and leave. That way of clearing a village, that kind of violence depends on the victims of it knowing exactly what's going on and responding. Here's another way of accomplishing the same thing. Figuring out how to get those people to fight one another. Now that way of accomplishing what is in effect the same goal depends on the victims not knowing that that's what's going on, because if they realize that they've been pitted against each other for the purpose of killing one, then it wouldn't work. And the thing about this method of division and conquering is that it does work. Apart from naked force, nothing works better. The most ancient, the most proven way of subordinating a group of people is to pit them against each other so that they cannot fight shoulder to shoulder in a common struggle against their real enemy. And that's what solidarity is. It's acting from the recognition that you have been pitted against someone who is not your enemy by someone who is. Now, it's essential to solidarity that it take place against the background of a purposeful falsehood. You just can't act in solidarity with someone who very obviously shares exactly the same interests as you. It's only solidarity if you're acting from a shared interest that's been purposefully hidden from you to the advantage of those who rule over you. Now, the lines along which a group of people are pitted against each other need not be racial. They could be lines of gender or sexuality or religion. The lines could be national borders, so that workers in the US are pitted against workers in China. Or again, the workers born in the US could be pitted against those who have migrated to the US from Mexico. And under capitalism, each individual worker is pitted against other workers in a competition for jobs. So there's a lot of pitting of one of us against another of us. This idea about solidarity is, I think, the cornerstone of Marxist politics. We can compare what Douglas says about poor blacks and whites in the southern US to what Marx says about the English and the Irish workers of England. This is the second quotation on the handout. He says, all English sorry, not the second, it's the fourth. All English industrial and commercial centers now possess a working class split into two hostile camps. English proletarians, English workers, and Irish workers. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker because he sees in him a competitor who lowers his standard of life. Compared with the Irish worker, he feels himself a member of the ruling nation. And for this very reason, he makes himself into a tool of the aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, and thus strengthens their domination over himself. Meanwhile, the Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He, the Irishman, sees in the English worker both the accomplishment and the stupid tool of the English rule in Ireland. This antagonism is artificially sustained and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organization. It is the secret which enables the capitalist class to maintain its power, as this class is perfectly aware. And Marx applied exactly the same analysis to the United States of America. Expressing his support for the North in the Civil War, he wrote in Capital, "In the United States of America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, where in the black it is branded." So even today, obviously, labor in black skin is branded. Black people are branded in a way that is useful to, and because it is useful to, a tiny class of people who control the vast wealth of our society and who therefore control the things that all of us need for a decent life. The branding of black people is useful to this tiny class for exactly the reason that Frederick Douglass identified, because this pits labor in a white skin against. Now, our comrades sometimes put this point by saying that, or something in the area, by saying that racism is a necessary byproduct of capitalism. In fact, I've heard that said a couple times already at this year's conference, and it's common to read it even in our best literature. But I think this formulation is incorrect. That is, I think racism is not a byproduct of capitalism. What comrades want to say when they say this is that, at least in the US, capitalism and racism go hand in hand. The one necessitates the other. The problem with thinking about this necessitation on the model of a thing and its byproduct is that a byproduct has no function. It does no work in the process of which it is a byproduct. If I'm sawing a board because I'm building a house, well, then necessarily I'm going to make some sawdust. But in this scenario, the product of my labor is a house, and the sawdust is a byproduct. To call sawdust a byproduct is to say that it is an incidental side effect whose production serves no purpose in house building. Racism is not the sawdust of American capital. It is the saw. It is a tool in the hand of the ruling class, and unlike a byproduct, it has a definite function. Its function is to divide the working class. And we, for our part, we need to resist being so divided. And so we need to stop that tool from being used against us. So understood, the politics of solidarity is not some hippie fantasy based on a naive idea that we can all just get along and there are no real racial divisions in this country. It's based not on a warm feeling, but on a sober analysis of our situation and on a shrewd calculation about what it would take to change it. The first plate of the analysis is that we, ordinary people of frankly no matter what race or gender, we who work for a living or are expected to do so, and who, even when we're fortunate enough to get a steady paycheck, live from one paycheck to the next, we share a common enemy who is plundering us all. A tiny class of people who control the vast wealth of our society, and who therefore control the things we all need for a decent life, things like healthy food, education, medical care, leisure time, freedom from debt, an undestroyed environment, and not getting killed by the police. The second plank of the analysis is that this tiny class of people is able to plunder us largely because it is able to pit us against each other along lines of, for example, race. The shrewd calculation that follows from this analysis is that we must work together, that this is the only way we're going to be strong enough to defeat our common enemy. There's one more point to it, but I'll come back to that at the end. Because we are because we are many and they are few. We must not allow ourselves to be pitted against each other. In other words, we have to fight against every form of oppression, because every form of oppression divides our strength.